Hi everyone, welcome back to the second plenary session of the day here today. I'm Elisa with the PC, and I'm just going to do a couple of quick announcements for everyone who was standing in front of SeaWorld yesterday and did not get in. There was a little bit of a scheduling mistake. The SeaWorld social event is going to be happening tonight at 8 p.m. And for everyone who has not filled in the survey yet, please survey us. And we're going to start out with the first presentation out of 3 in this session here with Tim Strong from Telegeography talking about submarine cables. Welcome.
Good morning. My name is Tim Strong. I'm with the market research firm Telegeography, and I'd like to take about 30 minutes and present some of the data that we've been gathering for the last several years on the submarine cable sector and see how the developments in this transport layer sector have affected IP prices and transport prices. Everyone knows about the big bandwidth boom and bust that happened a little over a decade ago, but since then there have been a lot of developments in the submarine cable world, and there is a lot of activity even now going forward that's going to change things. As new capacity has come online, prices have shifted, and we're going to be talking about that. I'd like to divide the presentation up into several bite-sized chunks. First of all, I want to talk about recent cable investment. So just take a brief moment to look backwards at what has happened in the submarine cable world. Secondly, I want to talk about planned builds, to talk about what's going on in the future and how that might affect your businesses. Thirdly, I want to talk about some of the reasons there are to construct cables: demand, lack of supply potentially, prices, lack of competition in certain markets. Fourthly, as a bit of an aside, I want to talk about how users of this transport layer capacity have configured their circuits, specifically layer 3. So in other words, the geography of international connectivity. And finally, I want to wrap up by talking about what's going to happen with capacity prices, where we currently stand now, how transport prices affect IP transit prices, and where things might go. One thing that's occurred to me is a bit of an opportunity, that since NANOG is at Orlando this year, we're in the place really that Walt Disney built. So I thought it might be appropriate to have a separate sort of theme for the presentation today, the magical kingdom of submarine cables. I sort of stuck this in the middle of, or I didn't want to put this at the beginning of the presentation in case any Disney copyright lawyers are around, although I think we're good under fair use. So we're going to discuss different lands of the world of the submarine cables, and basically you kind of have two choices. If you're sitting there thinking, I don't really care about the transport, I really only care about layer 3, or you hate Disney, for example, and despise our way of life, well, this is only going to be 30 minutes, about 25-minute presentation, 5-minute Q&A afterwards if you have any questions. You're welcome to go out and have a coffee. On the other hand, if you're sitting there thinking, man, I love NANOG, but I wish there was someone who would present some information on submarine cables, and you kind of find yourself daydreaming about, I don't know, riding Space Mountain with your fellow Noggers, then all I can tell you is put your MacBook Airs down, sit back, and fasten your seatbelts, because Buster, you're in for the ride of your life. Yeah, check that out. Yeah? That's some advanced Microsoft technology right there. What can I say? This is magic. Okay, let's start. Let's talk about what's happened in the cable industry. And as I promised, we're going to be in the lands of the magic kingdom of submarine cables. So it occurred to me that cable operators are really pushing out the boundaries or the frontiers of what's happened in the world of connectivity, which countries are connected and which are not. So we're going to call this little section, Frontierland. Hope you like the bounce. That was, I've been wanting to use that one for years and never had an excuse to do it. Okay, so 1998, a little over a decade ago, here is a map of the countries in the world that had fiber optic connectivity. The countries in gray are the ones that, shaded in gray, the ones that had either a submarine cable connected to it or is landlocked, or was a country that had access to a submarine cable via a neighboring country with terrestrial fiber access. So you can see most of the developed markets in the world already had connectivity to at least one cable. The one shaded in red did not. There were quite a few countries in red that still did not have access to a single cable. Much of Africa, for example, was like that, parts of South America. In fact, in 1996, I believe, the population of the world in countries that did not have access to a cable is about 4.8 billion. That's now less than 10 million. Here's a map of the countries of the world that don't have access to a cable. And in fact, I just recently learned that I probably should have shaded Somalia, Cambodia, and even North Korea in gray because they have overland access to countries that do have fiber. Although, not surprisingly, apparently the North Korean connection isn't heavily used. But the frontier has expanded. Lots of connectivity. Here's a list of the countries that I was able to find, and I could be wrong on some of these, that do not yet have submarine cable connectivity. The list is growing to Africa. But look at the actual usage. Just one country in Latin America, Brazil, uses 3 times the amount of international bandwidth than all of Africa combined. So it's been an uneven development in the last several years. But things are changing. We're going to move on to our next section. We're going to traipse over to the next land of the Magic Kingdom of submarine cables and talk about what's happening in the future of submarine cables. Now, you may think we're going to Tomorrowland. That's not the case. If any of you have worked in the submarine cable industry and have dealt with environmental permitting for landing a submarine cable, or even worse, doing due diligence with banks and private equity firms, you know it's always an adventure. So we're going to move over to Adventureland. This map schematic shows the number of proposed cables by regions of the world for the next several years. The number shows the number of cables in that region. You can see there's an awful lot of interest in building cables in and around Latin America, also in the South Pacific and Australia. Even the North Atlantic, which had a tremendous amount of build about a decade ago, has 2 or 3 systems planned. And even the Arctic has a couple of, there are some companies that would like to build a cable, one over Siberia and one over through the Northwest Passage across Canada. So lots of really interesting ideas in the cable world. The problem is it's a difficult market to get funding. So this actually shows the ones that we at Telegeography think are currently funded. That's as of today. It could change tomorrow. There are some cables that apparently are fairly close to getting their funding. So the numbers really dwindle when we look at it this way. From 8 to 3 in the Pacific, from 9 to 4 in Latin America. So where is the development happening? We think that there are currently 12 cable systems that have reached funding or are almost there in terms of funding. 10 of those 12 are in just 3 regions. One in Latin America, or one region is in Latin America. Another is Southeast Asia, and thirdly, the South Pacific. I'm guessing that not too many of you are terribly interested in the South Pacific islands, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Tonga, and so forth, so I'm not going to really direct any more remarks to that area. Southeast Asia may be of interest to you, but prices there are already very, very competitive. Where I think a lot of interesting developments are destined to happen is Latin America. So most of my remarks are going to be focused on that region. There's also a lot of talk about other regions of the world, but so far, not a lot of action. Transatlantic, for a couple of years now, there have been new cables planned in that region, but to my knowledge, none has reached full funding status yet. Australia, a lot of new cables planned for that area. We'll see what happens. Even across the Pacific, where there's fairly recently been some builds, a lot of rumors now about new cables going in there. So we'll see. But let's focus in on Latin America. there are several cables that are planned, and many of which are funded, and they generally start from the top. This is listed by RFS date, or ready for service date, by submarine cable. GlobeNet is an existing provider of submarine cable service down to Latin America from the United States. They're planning on an overbuild or a second cable between the northeastern U.S. and Bermuda, and also an extension of their current cable to Colombia, which is not really a separate cable. It's more an extension of the cable, but Colombia is a pretty fast-growing market, so that's interesting. America Movil, which is, you may know as Telmex, owned by Carlos Slim, they're building their own cable. Angola is building a cable to Brazil, which is pretty interesting. And then further down below are some of the ones that are planned but don't yet have funding, and I want to talk about these individually. First of all, AM1, America Movil 1. This is the Slim cable. Pretty extensive system. I don't know if it's going to be a game changer in terms of you as buyers of either transport or IPT. And that's because to date, the planners of this cable have been steadfast in saying that they mainly plan to use this cable for their own internal use, not planning to heavily use it as a wholesale mechanism. So they will not be or they're saying they're not going to be selling a lot of transport capacity on the cable. So we'll see whether or not it affects the market. PCCS is an interesting system. It goes to the west coast of South America. It's a consortium system owned by several different cables. So again, I'm not quite sure how this is going to play in the market. Then we get to some interesting systems that haven't yet reached full funding, but if they do, will change your lives if you're trying to get down to Argentina and Brazil and other markets. One is called Cibras. It's a private system, essentially going to be working on the wholesale model. They're looking for to finish their funding. A cable with a similar topology is called Wasase, and they have very ambitious builds. This is just one part of their build, which is the U.S. to Latin America portion. Again, they're looking for funding as well. And by the way, these screenshots are pulled from submarinecablemap.com, which is run as a free resource by Telegeography. So if you want to play around with these, you're welcome to get on, preferably after my presentation. But and you zoom out a bit, this is SACS, a South Atlantic cable system. It's essentially run by a consortium of Angolan carriers, which is kind of interesting, Angola to Brazil. This is relevant to you even if you have no interest in Angola-Brazil capacity for a couple reasons. One, it would enable South Africa to U.S. capacity, which I'm guessing if they can get the right connections, the latency would be just as fast from South Africa to Miami as it is right now from London to South Africa. But also, they really need to get their capacity to Florida or to New York. So they may be encouraged to build their own system to connect the South Atlantic system. Okay, so that's a glimpse at what's happening with the future of cables. Let's look at, for a few minutes, at some of the reasons that are given to build these systems. There are some very good reasons, and you occasionally hear in the market some very bad reasons. One that I don't know why it really gets on my nerves is we need to build a cable to this country because they're hosting the Olympics or the World Cup. I think really the 90 terabits of unused, unlit capacity is not going to be enough to handle the Olympics. So there are some myths in the industry. So we're going to call this land of the Magic Kingdom of submarine cables Fantasyland. Some bankers live in Fantasyland until they really do their due diligence. One reason that we're not going to see cable builds, which is a traditional reason why we have seen cable builds, is capacity exhaustion. Up until just a few years ago, the amount of potential capacity that was not lit was beginning to dwindle. Demand was, because of growing demand, people were lighting new wavelengths. The amount of unlit wavelengths in these cables was going down. So eventually you're going to run out of capacity and you're going to build new systems, right? Not really. Something strange has happened. It's not that demand has gone down. Demand continues to be strong, But the technology, the upgrade technology in submarine cables has really changed in the last few years. Cable operators are able to squeeze far more wavelengths at far greater bit rates than thought possible just a few years ago. So now we know that the potential capacity on the existing systems is far higher than previously thought. So yeah, demand is still growing strong. This is just Latin America. You can see the red line is annual growth, the percent of annual growth each year in terms of used international bandwidth. And by that, we're defining it as the amount of capacity actively used in networks. So we, Telegeography, go out and survey people like you, and under NDA get information on how much capacity you're running on layer 3 or other types of networks, and then add them all up. So it's growing very rapidly, about 53% last year, which is a good bit higher than the global average. So very strong demand in Latin America, so that's a good reason. Why is this happening? End user growth in South America is very strong. The red line is the number of broadband subscribers, just fixed, by the way. Mobile is even higher than this. Fixed broadband subscribers has gone up, and at the same time, the speed of their individual connections has gone up as well. So end users are pushing this. Who's connecting these subscribers? Well, unfortunately, all that really cool capacity data that we're able to collect, we can't really break down at the individual carrier level to publish because it's under NDA. So one thing I've done is just some basic BGP analysis, adding it all up by carrier. So worldwide, the upstream ISPs with one-hop ASN adjacency or access to just broadband ISPs, if you add it all up, the number of subscribers of those ISPs, level 3 and then Telia are 1 and 2 in the world. And this is not necessarily reflective of traffic or of revenues or anything like that. This is just pure ASN reach. But it's kind of interesting if you look at Latin America, the people who are the biggest in the world overall aren't necessarily the biggest in that region. In the Caribbean, in Atlantic, which is an admittedly small market, Verizon and Broadband One, aka Host.net, were number 1 and 2, at least of last time we took a measurement. In Central America, América Móvil, building a cable, number 1. And this is interesting. South America, the biggest upstream ISPs to broadband ISPs in the region, number 1, Telefonica, number 2, Telecom Italia. And that's relevant because of the next slide. At the transport layer, you have many choices of different cables, but essentially there are 3 big boys. One is level 3, which also sold a fiber pair on their submarine cable to Telecom Italia. The Telecom Italia calls it Latin American Nautilus, but it's essentially just a fiber pair on Global Crossings network. Secondly, Telefonica. So we're seeing that some of the people who are big in the ISP space are also big in the transport space. And thirdly, GlobeNet. So there's limited competition, and as we'll see later on at the end of the presentation, prices have not fallen nearly as fast down to Latin America as they have in certain other parts of the world. So let's move on to see, we've seen how much capacity ISPs have deployed in their networks. Let's look at where they've deployed them. In other words, the geography of international connectivity. So what land are we going to now in the Magic Kingdom of submarine cables? We're going to Main Street, USA. And that's because, and this still astonishes me, most of international Latin America capacity does not go between countries in Latin America. It goes up to the United States, specifically New York, and most especially Miami. That's not the case in other parts of the world that have more competition and more robust internal, intra-regional capacity, such as Asia and Europe. You see there, those lines are going down. They're far less dependent on U.S. Connectivity and U.S. content. They connect instead with each other in their countries, in their region. This is a list of the 10 biggest international internet routes in Latin America. All the ones that are within Latin America are colored red. And you can see there's only one of those that's of Buenos Aires, Santiago. Everything else goes up to Miami or to Dallas or to New York. So right now, all roads do lead northward. And why is that? Well, there are various kind of complicated reasons, but one compelling reason is price, and that leads us to the last portion of our slide, the future of capacity prices. And I'd also like to talk about where prices currently are. So what land are we going to? And as we finish our tour of the Magic Kingdom of submarine cables, any guesses? So we're going to end up in Tomorrowland. You finally get to ride Space Mountain. One reason to connect to Miami prices. We're looking here at GigE IP transit prices collected in December or so. And these are median prices. Actual IP transit prices go over a pretty big range that we've observed. So this is right in the middle, the median of our observations. Put Miami on here, very low. I think the median price for GigE was $1.50 or something like that. For you can find on the low end for 10 GigE 75 cents or potentially even lower in Miami. Mexico City, there's been a lot of competition, price competition there. But you move to South America and Central America and you see that prices are far higher. I'd like to focus especially on Sao Paulo, which is of interest to a lot of ISPs and content providers because Brazil is such a big market. Very expensive to access the internet from a provider in Sao Paulo. It's going to be generally between $20 and $30, often on the upper end of that scale. So you compare that to Miami, $1, and Sao Paulo, $20 to $30. It's a tremendous difference. So that's one reason that a lot of ISPs choose to instead buy transport up to the U.S. and get their transit there. But if you're an American content provider, a European content provider, an ISP, and you want to get to the internet in Sao Paulo, it's also a problem for you because if you want to buy locally in those markets and you're not able to peer for whatever reason, it can be an expensive proposition. So not only are prices lower in the United States and in Asia and other parts of the world, the last few years we've also seen that prices have fallen faster in those areas. That's a little counterintuitive. Normally what we see is when there's a region of the world or country of the world with very high prices, we tend to see prices falling faster there because there's more scope for decline there. That's not been the case the last few years. We will see what happens in the coming few years as some of this new infrastructure comes into play in South America. I would not be surprised to see these numbers flip. I kind of like this slide. It still amazes me. We had been looking at IP transit prices. Now we're looking at transport prices, so circuit prices. This is for a wavelength, a 10 gig wavelength, point to point. I believe these are all pop to pop, in fact, for various parts of the world. London, New York, if you really want to buy a 10 gig wave, you're in luck because prices there are really low. Average $8,000 to $9,000 per month for a 10 gig wave. Compare that to about $16 million for an STM1 when Atlantic Crossing came out. Big change. LA, Tokyo, Trans-Pacific prices, those are really tanked in the last couple of years. I think we're showing the median price in the 20s, $20,000 per month. I've heard as low as $16,000 from a few people on that route under special circumstances. Intra-Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, also very competitive. But then you look at Miami, Sao Paulo, $75,000 median price. Now again, prices are on a range. There's sometimes you hear lower, sometimes higher. Prices on that route have fallen, but it's a tremendous difference. And a lot of that has to do with the relatively limited competition, lack of transport choices down to Latin America. Also limited backhaul choices once you get to Latin America, which is a different story that the new submarine cables aren't necessarily going to solve. So I just wanted to throw that caveat out there. And finally, the last slide or two I have here compares IP transit prices versus transport prices. And this is all based on monthly price per meg, kind of like you price a port, IP transit port in the city. You generally don't think of transport prices in that way, but I wanted to be able to layer them on top of each other. So let's just go line by line here. Miami IP Transit, if you want to buy a 10 gig port for just transit in a pop in Miami, the prices have been low and they've fallen. They're still very low. That's the blue line at the very bottom. Now, if you want to buy transit from Miami to Sao Paulo, that's the yellow or orangish colored line. You see that has come down. It has come down quite a bit. However, the price is still very high. And if you were, for example, an ISP in Brazil and you wanted to buy transit up in Miami, in order to do that, you want to buy transport to get to Miami, that's the green line. So that's Miami IPT plus transport. But what if you want to buy local IP transit in Sao Paulo, if you're an ISP down there, or if you're a US ISP and you want to move down to there? That's the red line. So you can see that there's still quite a big gap between the option of going to Miami and buying transport or getting local IPT in Sao Paulo. Various reasons for this, but one clear thing that it suggests to me is that the cost of transport between Brazil and Latin America to the US still plays a very important role. So we're going to see what happens. We know that there are going to be a lot of cables built to Latin America. Some of them, if they're funded, may have very aggressive pricing schemes. It's a little early to say, but history suggests from our submarine cable industry that when lots of cables are built, especially if some of them have wholesale models, prices do tend to fall, and some of these prices can fall fairly rapidly. So we'll see what happens. And that's the conclusion of my presentation. And I'd like to open it up for any questions if there are any.
Hi, Doug Midori, Renesis. First, I wanted to thank you for your presentation, and also thanks for the new 2013 submarine cable map. The old-timey style is very cool. Do you guys ever consider putting a sea monster down in the corner or anything?
We thought about that. Doug's talking about a new map that we've come out with. It's Victorian style, and we thought about sea monsters maybe next time.
Okay.
But I have a few samples if anyone wants to take a look.
All right. So my real question is with the American Mobile, the AM1 cable going in Latin America, there's a case where the cable, you've got a company that's cash rich, they can pay for this cable for sure. They've got a captive audience of subsidiaries in every one of those countries, so they know they're going to have customers there. Out of all these cables, that one seems like that's a no-brainer. Seems like once that's established and all their subsidiaries now are using their own cable to do international traffic, it seems like they're going to pull demand, I would imagine, out of whatever are the current cables. And will there be enough growth in demand to absorb the loss if those guys were to move to the AM1 cable, and then still increasing additional cables on top of perhaps a loss in the overall demand?
I suspect there will be sufficient demand. I don't know if it can support 2 or 3 new wholesale cables, but it can definitely support at least one. Not only is demand growing rapidly, but there's probably pent-up demand. The Brazil numbers just showed briefly the end user growth. The U.S. is sort of saturated at 67% broadband subscriber per home. Brazil's at 30% and still growing. So there's a lot of pent-up demand, and prices are still high enough. So even if they really tank, at least for a few years, you're going to get a pretty good return on your investment. So I think there's still a pretty strong business case for some wholesale builds down, even with that AM1 coming online.
Okay, thanks.
Matthew Molecroft from Amazon. Just curious, what are your thoughts about? I mean, at the end of the day, most of us want some sort of diversity, and if only one cable comes along, is that enough to break the stranglehold? I mean, our sort of experience in Australia shows that sometimes it does, because people rebalance. But ultimately, to get diversity, you still need to buy on the original cables, and they can keep the prices high. So if we only build one cable down there, is that going to be enough to drive down the prices a lot? Or do you think the others will play ball?
Yeah, I'm not sure just building AM1 is going to be enough to drive down prices, but if one of these other systems comes online, yes, they're point-to-point systems. They're not full rings like the old I wouldn't call them old-timey, but the older systems from a decade ago. So you'll still need diversity. But in some respects, it's kind of a cozy market right now for these suppliers, and if they start seeing a lot of their customers going away, they're going to be forced to respond. And they do have a lot of spare capacity, so that's not the problem. It's more an issue potentially of competition. So I suspect there could still be sufficient diversity even with only one or two more cables.
Thanks.
Hi, Steve Powell, Level 3. I just had a quick question. Most of the countries, I'll say on the east side of South America, generally have very high tariff structures, usually in excess of 100%, compared to, let's say, these countries on the west side of the Andes, which is usually in a 20 to 30% region. And my question is, do you see that as having any impact in, let's say, preventing, let's say, or thwarting, future build-outs because of that high cost, not just for submarine cable, but for any type of infrastructure build-out?
Yeah.
And are you seeing those numbers reflected in the in terms of what you're seeing for statistics on the east side versus the west side?
I don't have a lot of data. Tariffs in terms of government regulations and fees?
Correct.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of data on per country, just more anecdotal. But yes, I absolutely see this as a problem, and I kind of glossed it over for the interest of time during my presentation. But it is a potential problem for business plans of these cables and for the market in general. Just a few examples. In Brazil, from what I hear, there's a 100% tariff on imported networking equipment. So if you really want to have a data center, if you want to go down there, you want to buy, even if you can get cheap transport down to Brazil, you have your own data center, and peer with everyone, you think it's going to be great, it still could be very expensive. I also heard, now I don't know if this is still true, but Argentina, trying to keep its current account in balance, does not like people bringing in foreign goods, and it can take a long time. So even if there's not necessarily a tariff, there could be a lot of red tape for that. So it is a potential problem, and I don't know if that's going to get solved anytime soon.
Yeah, and I just you sort of confirmed some of my suspicions because you mentioned all those very, very high traffic flows from New York and Miami, and that was my thought. Maybe people have made the decision is cheaper to build their data center to support Latin America in North America instead for that very reason.
The latency concerns, though, and there are so many customers down there potentially. But yeah, let's say you build in Santiago like Google is building. Well, there's no new cables being built down there, so either you're going to have to hope for a new system or you're going to buy capacity on one of the existing systems. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much.
One quick question. 1 second. We had one question on the chat that I want to post out here. I missed the Olympics and World Cup slide about capacity in South America. What are the predictions for the next big event?
Big event?
Big sports events coming up. What are you expecting for South America to happen?
From what we've seen, like the London Olympics, specific carriers that handle it will see a big increase, but from what I've seen globally or even for the country, it's not a huge change. So I don't think that's a game changer, no pun intended, for the overall capacity industry in Brazil.
Perfect. Thank you,
All right,
Tim.
thank you. Thanks, everyone.